Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're watching this from. After a number of years of not hearing about the Islamic State in the mainstream media, the group's recent external operations in Iraq, Turkey, Russia, and Oman has sparked interest once again in the Islamic State's evolution 5 years since it lost its territorial control in Iraq and Syria. However, the group has not gone anywhere. Other issues have instead taken to the fore. That is why this event is so important to remind that many of IS's injustices of the last decade remain unresolved, even as they continue to commit new crimes. Throughout its rule in Iraq and Syria in particular, the Islamic State employed an ideologically driven system of control and persecution, resulting in widespread gendered violence perpetrated by and against men, women, and even children. On the 10th anniversary of the start of the group's genocidal campaign against the Yezidi community, the Islamic State's ideology persists, and its members have yet to be held fully accountable for the crimes against civilian and minority populations. This panel seeks to shed light again on a topic that lingers for the victims of the Islamic State. To address the Islamic State's violence under its rule and since, as well as address local and international policy responses, we have three excellent speakers here today. First, we'll have Dr. Gina Vale speaking about life under the Islamic State's Caliphate, as well as its gendered violence. Gina is a criminology lecturer at the University of Southampton and an associate fellow with the International Center for Counterterrorism. Her feminist intersectional research on terrorism and governance includes the forthcoming book, The Unforgotten Women of the Islamic State, which you should pre-order online. It's on Amazon if you want. Then we'll have Dr. Devorah Margolin. She'll be discussing the post-Caliphate environment, looking at ongoing IS ideology and violence, as well as local and international policy responses, including the indefinite detention and repatriation issue. Dr. Devorah Margolin is the Blumenstein-Rosenbloom Senior Fellow here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, as well as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and co-editor of the new Institute compilation, Jihadist Governance and Statecraft, with myself. So find it online. It's a PDF document. Her research focuses on strategic communications, propaganda, and the role of women and gender in violent extremism, among other topics. I also think it's important to point out that Dr. Margolin and Dr. Vale just came out with a new article in CTC Sentinel yesterday called In the Shadow of the Caliphate, a Decade of Islamic State Gendered Violence. So those interested in this topic, you got a fresh new research article. So I definitely recommend reading it. Finally, we also have Pari Ibrahim, and she'll explore the Yezidi pursuit of justice and need for accountability and the use of core international crimes and also those who funded the ideology of the group. Pari Ibrahim is the founder and executive director of the Free Yezidi Foundation. Her advocacy for survivors of the Islamic State's Yezidi genocide has included numerous publications in media outlets worldwide, as well as testimony before the UN Security Council and other international institutions. There's also a new publication by her foundation, the Free Yezidi Foundation, alongside Yazda and Sinjar Academy called 10 Years After Genocide, the Yazidi Struggle to Recover and Overcome, another important publication I definitely recommend. So as a few housekeeping notes, the speakers will have 5 minutes each for opening statements, and then we'll open up for the question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question of our panelists during the event, for those in the Zoom, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And for those watching this policy forum on the Washington Institute's website or live streaming on YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Thank you again for everybody listening in and watching today. Gina, take it away.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for the introduction and also for hosting this event at TWI. I really appreciate it. This really is an opportunity for us to sit back and commemorate and reflect upon the violences that were committed and atrocities committed by Islamic State throughout their occupational years and since. And this is something that the other panelists will be talking about. But I really want to talk about how the group's ideology really drove and legitimated and facilitated gendered violence within the Caliphate. So Islamic State really took up an ideology of binarized gendered roles, the idea that men should be militarized and have public-facing roles and women were expected to be sedentary and domesticated at home. So you have this public-private split. That was then reflected in behavioral regulations and also tactics that concerned the legitimate victimization and violence against individuals within the group's territory. And throughout the group's territory, this violence was facilitated by the group's bureaucracy, its legislature, and then undertaken through its governance structures. So if you look at men and boys, this was expected militarization, as I said. There has been a lot that has been written about the Caliphate training program, the expectation for boys to undertake militarized training and then to participate in extreme acts of violence at their own hands. In some cases, this is also executions in public spaces too. But this also then spilled into executions of the enemy, and the expectation that men who were an enemy of the Islamic State were automatically dehumanized and expected to be victimized. This really does contrast in the group's expectations for women and girls within its territory. So that expected domesticity was laid out across the group's public spaces, and also its expected gendered segregation of these institutions. So you effectively had parallel institutions throughout the Caliphate in Iraq and Syria. This did not offer what we would consider tailored or specialized services that could serve women and girls' needs. In fact, far to the contrary. There was forced unemployment, widespread financial deprivation and therefore dependency on male relatives, and also deprivation of education and healthcare. And in fact, from my own research and interviews with women who've lived under Islamic State control, we see these institutions having been converted from spaces that should have been caring for civilians and instead becoming sites of gendered violence and even brutalization at the hands of, in many cases, IS-affiliated women. So we have this structured society within Islamic State where IS women, affiliated women, gained power over other women. And so we can see an intra-gendered system of violence as well. But as I said, the group's aim was to erase women eventually from that public sphere. Women needed a mahram or a male guardian to go around outside of their own home. They were subject to extremely strict and religiously conservative dress codes, eventually erasing all aspects of their body and including a twin covered veil over their eyes. And also they were subject to travel restrictions that eventually put greater and greater constraints on their movement to the point where they were expected to stay within the home and only within their home. This created this sense of universal surveillance. It was effectively a deprivation of liberty. And while some women did willingly barricade themselves inside their own homes to protect themselves, this also opened up that unregulated home space as a site of further gendered victimization that went beyond the group strictures and regulations, i.e., this was a space of organic violence that was undertaken by individual militants and supporters. This is where, unfortunately, we have seen trends in forced marriage and even child marriage and great pressures on local women in order to marry into the group or for parents and relatives to marry young daughters in particular to the group's militants. But at this time, we would be remiss to not acknowledge the horrific atrocities and the genocide perpetrated against the Yezidi community in particular, but also other minority groups within Iraq and Syria. For Shia Muslims, it was pretty much kill on sight as the objective of Islamic State's ire and vehement hatred of what they called apostates against the group's worldview. For Christians, they did have some initial protections as people of the Abrahamic faiths, but later this was withdrawn. And in fact, we can see this also has a gendered angle when we look at the fact that later Christian women were also deemed to be acceptable to take as slaves within the group's territory. But it was the Yazidis that had the greatest focus within Islamic State's propaganda. Its premeditated and ideologically legitimized strategy of genocide against that group. Within a matter of days from the 3rd of August 2014, 9,900 Yazidis were killed or kidnapped. Most of the 6,800 kidnapped into Islamic State territory were women and young girls. A further 400,000 Yazidis were rendered internally displaced within Iraqi Kurdistan. Once within Islamic State territory, particularly women and children were subjected to dehumanizing treatment at a horrific scale, starting with sale as chattel through provincial and then local markets, slave markets. Once sold to private owners, particularly young virgin girls were valued most highly, and they were subject to rape, forced impregnation, in some cases forced miscarriage and abortion, and sexual assault. But also within that unregulated home space, they were deprived of their freedom of religion and belief. Many Yazidi women and children were subjected to forced religious dress, practices, and prayer, and therefore there was an intentional erasure of their Yazidi faith. It's also important to acknowledge, once again, that intra-gendered stratified system of governance and violence within the group's territory. Many of the Yazidi women that I interviewed said that they were subject to physical, verbal, psychological, and emotional abuse, and in some cases, what could even amount to torture in the unregulated home space that was committed by wives or female relatives of Islamic State militants. And again, with that forced religious practice, also in many cases, this was led by IS-affiliated women. So we really need to now consider the gamut of crimes that were perpetrated by Islamic State militants, their members and supporters, how different spaces were utilized to commit, legitimate, and facilitate these gendered crimes, and acknowledge the ways in which individuals have suffered under Islamic State's control, and, as the other speakers will attest to, continue to do so in the wake of the Islamic State's collapse. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Gina. Devorah?
Thank you. That was a very wonderful kind of setup of how the Islamic State thought about gender and race and religion and violence over the last 5 years of what they held territory. But even without its caliphate, the Islamic State's gendered violence has continued because its supporters and its ideologies remain. And unfortunately, due to lack of timely and appropriate responses by the local and international community, this has perpetuated this violence. And we see a situation in which both the perpetrators and the victims of the Islamic State violence have remained in a sort of limbo. In Syria, thousands of men, women, and children are held in these detention facilities and detention camps under the control of the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, as well as its military arm, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Once holding over 80,000 people, today 54,000 remain in indefinite detention across 27 detention facilities and 2 detention camps. And I want to flag that the division of these detained populations and the treatment that they are given reflects highly gendered assumptions about their ideological commitment and risk. And this is actually informed mostly by what we just heard from Dr. Vale about IS's own ideology and how they trained and stipulated gender roles. And in detention camps like Al-Hol and Roj, the majority of these residents are women and young children, with 62% under the age of 18. In addition to the humanitarian crisis and widespread insecurity in these camps, gendered violence has continued in 3 main ways. We see exploitation and abuse of camp residents by aid workers and security forces. We see intra-resident violence that's enforced continued adherence to the Islamic State's ideology and behavioral codes, including dress. And we see the claim of sexual exploitation of young boys by women residents in order to reproduce the next generation of the Islamic State. Moreover, years later, Yazidi victims have been found still among the population in Al-Hol, some remaining there by choice for fear of being separated from their children, while others have been forced to stay in hiding by Islamic State-affiliated women. The majority of women and children are in detention camps, but the majority of men and some boys, some taken as young as the age of 14 in Baghouz, Syria, are held in detention facilities on account of the perceived threat that resulting from indoctrination and training. And when it comes to boys specifically, one issue that has been caused by the indefinite detention is that they are coming of age in these detention camps like Al-Hol, but they're deemed a security risk and then separated from their families. The detainee issue is a huge burden on the autonomous administration, and they've tried to resolve this by encouraging repatriation of foreign nationals, as well as granting amnesty specifically to Syrians in SDF-held territory, with approximately 1,500 low-level militants released from detention facilities and 10,000 affiliated families released from Al-Hol. They've also held trials. Around 8,600 individuals have been held Syrians have been held to trial in the autonomous administration areas. There's never been trials for third country nationals, despite the threat to do so. And they've not utilized international law in their prosecutions or any gender-based crimes. In Iraq, we're seeing a lot of frustration over funding and programming available for IS-affiliated families, but not those victimized by the group. For example, many Iraqis displaced by the Islamic State, specifically minority groups, have been living in IDP camps for the last 5 years, more than that even. But these have been systematically closed by the Iraqi government, with the last IDP camp set to close this summer. And instead of reintegrating these individuals back into society, unfortunately, these IDP camps have become these informal settlements where individuals continue to live, but without government resources, creating very vulnerable populations. There have been some constructive steps, the 2021 Yezidi Survivor Law, for example, but even these have been criticized for flawed implementation. Other groups remain mostly ignored. For example, the Iraqi Christian community has received significantly less attention from authorities. Overall, many minority groups in Iraq have felt the inadequate steps towards achieving justice, peace, and continued security. For IS-affiliated individuals in Iraq, Iraq's anti-terrorism legislation is pretty all-encompassing. You get the same penalty for being a low-level member of the group or a high-level member of the group. The system in Iraq has been highly criticized for arbitrary detention, flawed trials, evidentiary issues, prosecution of minors, and mass executions. To date, Iraq, despite US urging, has not utilized international law to prosecute IS-related crimes. Moreover, UNITAD, the mission to collect information and preserve evidence of the crimes committed by ISIS, is set to expire in September. And this is going to create very many difficulties for those seeking to receive justice. That being said, Iraq, despite being long reluctant to repatriate, since 2021 has brought back 9,500 individuals from Syrian detention camps and 1,200 from Syrian prisons. Finally, the international community. There are more than 60 countries with third country national citizens detained in Syria alone. After initial spike in repatriations in 2019, many of these countries have been slow and reluctant, using tactics such as non-responsiveness or revoking citizenship. To date, we know that 35 countries with citizens have not conducted any repatriation operations. But since 2019, an estimated 3,600 third country nationals have been returned or repatriated to their countries of origin of 40 different countries. But this process is slow and gendered, and many countries specifically remain reluctant to repatriate men and teenage boys. And this is just the first step in the process. That also includes, for many countries, accountability. But even those countries that do choose to use criminal justice efforts, there's a variation. Some countries use local terrorism legislation, like the United States, while others use core international crime, with Germany leading the way. But there's gendered issues here too. Those that use core international crimes have largely used them against female defendants. But in fact, the majority of those who've been repatriated and thus held accountable are women. And these women were often relegated to peripheral roles under the Islamic State system of control. On the other hand, other countries have taken a gendered approach and only charged and sentenced adult men while never charging or granting amnesty to adult women. I'll conclude with some final thoughts that despite its territorial defeat, the Islamic State's ideology remains. The responses from Syria, Iraq, and the international community have been highly gendered and at times exacerbated, or even created new forms of gendered violence in the years since the Caliphate's collapse. We see these siloed approaches to accountability plagued by narrow investigative strategies, evidentiary problems, and the exclusion of victims. And this has really hamstrung efforts to find meaningful justice. But the biggest barrier to accountability is repatriation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Devorah. Looking forward to your thoughts, Pari. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In a few days, on 3 August this year, it will be 10 years since Islamic State started its genocidal campaign against the Yezidi community. We take this moment to look back at what happened and remember those we lost. But we also look and assess what was done for our community and also how the future looks like. My fellow panelists have talked a little bit about justice and accountability, and that's one angle I want to talk about, because I would say that when it comes to justice and accountability, I think we failed my people, the Yezidi community. Our people see justice and accountability as having their day in court, being able to explain to the world that the perpetrator committed certain crimes. And if we look at over the last 10 years, we wanted initially a international or hybrid tribunal. That just didn't happen because everyone thought like the ICC is there, ICC can make sure that there is justice and accountability. In 2015, myself and Yazda, we went to the ICC to ask for a preliminary investigation into the crimes committed by ISIS members from member states to the ICC. Unfortunately, nothing happened. The idea is now that the idea was we won't give you a hybrid tribunal, we won't give you an international tribunal. What we will do is we will create UNITAD, a UN investigative mechanism to look into the crimes that were committed by ISIS against Yazidis and others. Okay, we said, that's fine, we'll agree to that, and we'll try to support UNITAD. So my team, we've worked on crime scene analyses, making perpetrator dossiers, making sure that we would know which perpetrators were involved, in what villages were certain crimes committed, so that this could be shared with public prosecutors around the world, so that we and IIIM, the UN investigative mechanism for Syria, and UNITAD, to ensure that there is one day justice. We know that like millions and millions of dollars were invested in UNITAD, and we were okay with that because we knew that at least investigations would start. But now the closure of UNITAD is set for September, the mandate ends, and what happens now? I feel that our community has been let down by the international community. We have a handful of cases, and mostly in Germany. What we see is everyone is being indicted for terrorism, but I understand ISIS was a terrorist organization, but they were also a genocidal organization. They came to destroy the Yazidi community. They came to eradicate us from the earth. They did not succeed, but horrible crimes were committed. And for our community, it is important that we see that those crimes are the crimes that they are indicted for. So core international crimes, rape, murder, etc. And we need to see that. And it's happening in Germany, just a few cases I know, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Belgium. They're working on those cases. They're trying to move forward with that. So I feel in the future we will see much more, but we're not talking about 10 or 20 ISIS members. We're talking about like tens of thousands of ISIS members. And many of them got away with that and with the crimes that they committed. And like we hear more and more about a law that they are preparing in Iraq to give amnesty to ISIS family members. We hear recently, 2 weeks ago, that the SDF is going to let possible perpetrators go because they do not have food to give to the ones in prison. This is unacceptable, because how do we know that these people in the prison have not committed horrendous crimes against the Yazidi community? Are we just assuming, just by looking at them, that they didn't do anything and they're free to go? I feel like this is not what the Yazidi community deserved. And we have like laws and regulations and treaties and everything is in place, but if you look in practice, it's not working. And that is very dangerous, especially if you look at like, okay, if the SDF is going to let all the perpetrators in jail go, they're going to go and towards Europe. And we know that there are many ISIS members who are now in European countries. And so the crimes that were committed in Iraq and Syria, soon you'll see these crimes committed in Europe. So for our community, I think it is important that the world does not, after 10 years, forget what happened to our people, but also that we move towards justice and accountability. Give us our Nuremberg trials. Give us a chance to have a court, an international tribunal, a hybrid tribunal, to give the people who suffered so much some sense of closure. And it happens with justice and accountability, because a lot of people are now pushing the Yazidi community into making sure that we go back in our community, go back home where it is not yet safe, that we go and accept our neighbors again. Many of them who joined the Islamic State, they have not been held accountable for that. And I feel like the international community is forcing us to move forward when we haven't been able to close those chapters of what happened to our community. I don't think it is fair. I think if we as an international community want to look at what the Yazidi community needs, I would advise everyone to look at the thoughts of myself, Murad Ismail from Senior Academy, and Natia Navruzov from Yazda, and look at our policy paper that we've written, because it is very important that instead of everyone assuming what the Yazidi community wants, why don't we look at the policy paper and just realize what we actually want? This is very clear. It explains from different on different subjects what the Yazidi community needs after 10 years of genocide. So when I talk about like forced reconciliation, we do not need that. Nobody needs to tell our community, let's all get back together, let's forget what happened. No, we want actual justice. Once we get actual justice, then we're at a different place in our life where we can say, okay, maybe we can forgive and forget and move on. But there's no closure. This chapter is still open. We're still missing over 2,600 women and children and some men. The international community has failed a genocide surviving community. It is, I'm sorry to say, it is unacceptable that we treat survivors in this way. For a lot of survivors, they give up hope, and they can't understand that even after genocide recognition, that not much is being done.
Thank you so much for your very important comments and message, Pari. And I'd also like to reiterate for those who might have not been able to read the title of the publication while she was holding it up. It's 10 years after genocide, the Yazidi struggle to recover and overcome, from the Free Yezidi Foundation, Yazda, and Sinjar Academy. So now we'll move on to the question and answer session. I just wanted to reiterate those who are watching online. If you would like to ask any questions of our panelists, please enter, for those in the Zoom, the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And if you're watching this policy forum on the website or on YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. As the moderator, I think I'll take the prerogative to ask some initial questions. I'll start off with Pari. What are the struggles you currently are facing at the Free Yezidi Foundation in trying to convince countries to use the core international crimes instead of terrorism charges for these ISIS members? And can you provide any more in-depth examples related to this? Thank you.
I think for many countries, it is easier to charge someone for terrorism because even traveling to Syria and joining Islamic State is one of the avenues that many are following. But when you go into the community, when you look at the people living in tents for 10 years, missing family members for 10 years, I myself, I'm still missing 19 girls from my family, you would think that, you know, it matters. Our people matter to the world. Our people matter to Iraq and Kurdistan. That something should be done. I feel like everyone is going for the easy way out. It is much more difficult to get someone on core international charges. But it doesn't mean that it's not there. We have and know of perpetrators that bought slaves on the market. And one of the examples is Samantha Al-Hassani here in the United States. I know it is a female, but we should not forget that she went with her husband to the slave market and bought Yazidi slaves on the market. These girls were then raped by her husband in her house. I do not believe that there is such thing as a benevolent slave owner. If you're a slave owner, you're a slave owner. Let that be clear. Let's not think that you can be a good slave owner, whether it's a man or a woman. And I think that here in the US, they dropped the ball on that. They could have added more charges to it. But I think they were too afraid that the jury would side with Al-Hassani because she's a woman. Al-Hassani is walking free now. She was just recently released. It is very sad for the Yazidi community to see that people actually just get away with the crimes that they committed. She was in jail for terrorism and traveling to Syria. And I think there was much more that could have been done. So this is just a small example. There are many other cases around the world, and we understand the need for investigation is there. And I feel like now that UNITAD is ending, I feel like that countries will have a out by saying, well, we don't have the right evidence to charge someone because now UNITAD is also leaving. And more, I feel like Yazidis are being pushed into the direction that we just need to accept it, that there will never be justice. And I think we're not there. We can't do that. We need to move on. We need to keep going. We need to make sure that investigations are ongoing. And we are supported by the US government to do so. So our organization will continue to investigate the crimes that were committed against our people. And we hope that the international community, public prosecutors around the world find it important to charge those members of the Islamic State.
Thank you so much, Pari. Devorah, how has the policy of indefinite detention in Northeast Syria perpetrated the Islamic State's gendered violence?
Thank you. I think what's really interesting is the autonomous administration, which is holding 54,000 individuals, is a non-state actor, and its non-state status, as well as geopolitical distractions, have basically, coupled with the international community's fatigue on addressing this issue. I think Pari addressed this point very importantly. Many countries are fatigued. They go for an easy win, which is understandable in some cases, but it does not necessarily mean accountability. for those that want it, or justice in the way that many of people want it. And so we have a fatigue regarding indefinite detention in Northeast Syria, and that's hindered the responses that we have to the ongoing detainee crisis and accountability. And so I think, as I mentioned, we see these three main forms of gendered violence in the camps, but the greatest victims of this, I think it's important to acknowledge, are children. I think one thing that Pari said, and I maybe didn't clarify good enough, which was that just because individuals are women does not mean that they lack the agency. When we look at the use of core international crimes predominantly on women, our issue isn't that that is happening. Our issue is that it's not happening also against men, right? That men are often the leaders of these groups, and so they need to be held accountable. And women who committed crimes that are under the core international crimes also need to be held accountable. But we also are talking about victims, right? 62% of the individuals in Al-Hol are under the age of 18. They've now been held in indefinite detention for 5 years, which means they're coming of age after the age of 18. Many countries will charge them for crimes they commit after the age of 18. And by not removing or repatriating these individuals, we're putting them in a situation, and the international community specifically is putting them in a situation of greater risk and continued Islamic State influence. And that's specifically for young boys. We call it it's been called the conveyor belt of incarceration. The SDF has a security issue. They're, dealing with a large population that the international community has not helped them in alleviating. And they are trying to police these camps. And so what happens in a camp like Al-Hol, where you have 43,000 people, at one point 70,000 people, is that as young boys reach teenagehood, they've flagged a number of issues where either boys seem to be indoctrinated or they believe boys are at risk of sexual violence. And so they feel the need for the security of the camp, according to the autonomous administration, to remove these boys. Originally, the SDF removed these boys and put them directly into prison with adult men. The international community had some backlash on that, obviously. And so they've created what they've called rehabilitation centers. There are two main rehabilitation centers where young boys are basically taken without their family's knowledge from the camps, put into these rehabilitation centers. Some of them have not had contact with family since being taken. And then they are given better treatment than they would definitely in prisons, and a little bit better than in the camps, because the autonomous administration views these young boys as victims. So they are given some healthcare, some education, some sports events and activities for them. But there's a problem, because what happens is they're not repatriated by their countries, and the international community is not repatriating these young men. Then at the age of 18, they're still moved to prisons with adult men. And that's why we call it the conveyor belt. And basically what we've seen is that without the power to deport foreign citizens or put individuals on trial, despite its threat to do so, the autonomous administration has basically tried to manage the situation, but sometimes with very gendered policies that can have negative impacts on specifically young people.
Great. Thank you so much for all that important information, Devorah. Gina, can you talk a bit about why it is so important to look at these overlooked communities?
Yes, thank you. I think, as Pari has said, that all of these communities have been forgotten, particularly since the collapse of the so-called Caliphate. As Devorah has spoken about, there has been a lot of local and international-led efforts and attention that has focused on what we do about IS-affiliated communities, so those that are now in detention centers or securitized camp settings. But that is at the expense of recognizing and responding to the needs of civilian and minority communities that were persecuted or subjected to violence and abuses under Islamic State rule. And within that, there are groups that are even further marginalized, whose plight at the hands of Islamic State have been very much overlooked. For example, starting with orphaned children. We're not talking about the orphaned children of IS-affiliated persons. We're talking about the orphaned children of local civilian and Iraqi, local Syrian and Iraqi civilians. Many of these children were left highly dependent upon IS's own governance structures and orphanages within the group's campaign, and therefore were put in a position of indoctrination, continued radicalization, and dependence on that group for their upbringing, their financial security, etc., and therefore have been in a vulnerable position with no positive adult influence for many years. If we add that to the case of local widows, for example, there have been a lot of analysis about the roles of IS-affiliated women, what happens when their husbands were killed in battle or supposedly martyred for the cause, the money that they would get, the expectation to remarry, etc. But what has been forgotten is the plight of local Iraqi, Syrian, and Kurdish widows. What happens to those women when their husbands were killed? They certainly were not given payouts. Many of the women that I interviewed have said that they were left very financially vulnerable, extremely insecure within their own homes, being forcefully evicted by militants, and again, subject to forced marriage. So endemic insecurity of local civilians that did not have that group membership and affiliation to fall back on. Also, anti-Kurdish violence. We need to acknowledge that even within civilian populations, many of the women that I spoke to had sons or even daughters held hostage within IS occupation in order to receive a ransom. Some Kurdish men were shot on sight for suspected affiliation or service with the Peshmerga or local police forces. So Kurdish civilians in particular, even though IS publications and propaganda stated that they were united as a brotherhood that knew no racial or ethnic bounds, this was not the case. This is not the case for local civilian communities. We also need to acknowledge the effective cleansing of LGBTQIA+ persons at the hands of the group. We see particularly greater theatricality of the murder of LGBTQIA+ men or males in particular, and this was often publicized executions in public spaces. But there is very little that we know about women and gender non-binary persons. So there needs to be greater acknowledgement and investigation of crimes and hidden and undocumented crimes by the group. And as I say, I think it's really important to acknowledge that all of these are forgotten communities. And if we really want what we can consider to be true justice and accountability, as all panelists have said, we need to go beyond blanket membership of a group, but actually understand the gamut of crimes that were committed, who they were committed by, and against whom they were committed as well, and what significance that had in how IS tried to fragment and then re-envision its society and the scars that are left behind.
Great. Thank you so much, Gina. We've gotten a few questions coming in over Zoom. I think this question is good for Pari. In the complex security environment of northern Iraq and Kurdistan, what should be considered the most immediate threat to Yazidis upon closure of the IDP camps?
Well, one thing we need to clarify is that the Iraqi government has now decided that they're not going to close down the IDP camps. This is happening constantly. So the Yazidis are being threatened. We're going to close down the camps. And then the Yazidis are like, okay, where are we going? It's not safe. And then the Iraqi government then decides again to halt that decision. When it comes to security, definitely read our policy paper. It will give you more insight on security. I think one of the things is that a lot of Yazidis think that because there are so many armed groups, that Yazidis will not be safe. We have to also think about the constant attacks from Turkey on Yazidi civilians who try to protect our people. It is very difficult to feel home in an area that is now inhabited by many different armed groups, and to think that you'll be safe. One of the things that happened to the Yazidis in 2014 is that Yazidis were not protected. Those who were supposed to protect the Yazidis ran away, and this has still impact on the Yazidi community and the trust in the militia, the armed groups that are there. Now you have different ones in Sinjar. Some of them are Yazidis. The Yazidis believe and trust the ones that are Yazidis, but the problem is here we have what we see is that there's a lot of different armed groups there that are part with they are a part of a political party, and this is very scary. So that means that Yazidis are, if they want to defend their own people, they now have to decide and choose which political party they join and their army, basically. And Yazidis want the Iraqi government to ensure that when it comes to an Iraqi army, have one army, don't have different militias, different armed groups running around in Sinjar. No, have them all be under the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Defense, pay them through the Iraqi government's funding budget, and make sure that they are part of protection for Iraq as a whole instead of a political party. And that's what we want to see. Sinjar is currently not safe. This is the main reason also why our people are not going back. I always say, you know, Yazidi community is very, they can live very basic. They do not need very luxurious things. That people are still displaced after 10 years says a lot, that even the basic cannot be provided, and that is safety and security, let alone the infrastructure, obviously.
There's a follow-up question from the same individual named Peyton for you, Pari. What does the path to increased political representation look like for Yazidis?
So Yazidis, we don't really have a voice politically. Again, this also has to do with different political parties. We always push for quota seats. So we want the Iraqi government to ensure that Yazidis who are not affiliated to any political party have an opportunity to be in the parliament. We don't feel that if a Yazidi is connected to a political party, that they can 100% guarantee that they are the voice for our community, because they will be guided by what the political party wants and needs. We want, just like, for example, an example is Kurdistan. They have quota seats for Armenians and other ethnic religious minorities, but they refuse to give Yazidis quota seats. We're pushing so much for quota seats so that our people can have a voice for ourselves, so that we can advocate for our own people in the country. As long as we don't have that, we feel like our people are being neglected. And a good example is, look at the rebuilding of Mosul. So after the Islamic State, Mosul is now rebuilt. You know, you can go to Mosul and you do not see a lot of damage from the Islamic State. You go to Sinjar, it's all in rubble. Why is that? Because Yazidis do not have political representation. And in Mosul, they do, and they are advocating for Muslawis. They're advocating for Mosul's rebuilding, and Yazidis just don't have that.
We have another question on the Zoom. This is for all the panelists, but maybe Devorah and Gina can take part in this. What do you think is the single most important issue for the outside world to pursue right now, you think, related to this topic?
Gina, you can go first.
Thanks. I think for me, it's true justice and understanding that justice means something different to different people, as Pari has very rightfully pointed out. But I think also this means inclusive justice. So looking at, as I've just gone through some of the crimes of marginalized and overlooked communities, really understanding what justice would mean to those communities for the crimes perpetrated against them and their relatives. but then that needs to be inclusive. And in order to achieve justice, we need to bring these communities into the system. We cannot have externally led and externally imposed systems and policies and programs that are not driven by the communities that they are affecting. So, for example, when we are trying to gather evidence, we need to involve the communities and individuals that were affected to the extent that they wish to be involved, whether that is within courts and tribunals or whether that is just evidence gathering mechanisms such as what was being spearheaded by UNITAD. We need to ensure that their voices and their experiences are recognized. That is step one. And then step two is to act upon those needs and ensure that they are delivered. So when we have undocumented crimes, whether it's against LGBTQIA+ women, for example, whether it's crimes perpetrated against widows, for example, whether it's undocumented and unregulated crimes perpetrated within the IS family home space, forced marriage, child marriage, all of these crimes that were not part of the group's documented strategies and policies, but were still undertaken and at quite a noticeably large scale by individual militants and supporters. We need to ensure that we have documented evidence and victim witness testimony in order to pursue justice and accountability. For all of my interviewees, and particularly for my Yazidi interviewees, every single one of them knew the kunyas of all of the IS militants and the families that held them in their homes. All of them knew those names. We might not necessarily be able to immediately and without a lot of research and effort match those with their individual identities, but that's a start. But if you don't ask, you will never get that information and justice will never be able to be achieved. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Devorah?
I think it's two-part, and I know you wanted one, but it's really two, because we're dealing with two different groups. We're dealing with perpetrators and we're dealing with victims, and they are interrelated, but there are also different needs for them. So for perpetrators, this actually applies to victims as well, which is agreeing with Gina on this one, accountability. In order to have accountability, you need to repatriate, which is step one. And also for victims, as Pari mentioned, for the communities are expected to just accept people when amnesty is granted. But research shows that in order to actually reintegrate back into society, there needs to be some sort of accountability coupled with that. And that accountability can look like different things, but there needs to be some sort of reckoning of sorts in which the victim communities feel wanting to open their arms and welcome people back, to feel or at least acknowledging the return of people, but forcibly returning people by granting amnesty without acknowledging any of the victim needs doesn't work. And so accountability is number one. And number two is victims, and thinking about what victims needs, because I think we often, specifically for the Islamic State, because it was a terrorist organization, we often think about it through the terrorism lens, and we don't think about it often through the victims lens. And victims are minority groups that were persecuted or had genocide committed against them by the Islamic State. It was civilian populations in Syria and Iraq. And it's also children who were either forcibly brought into this group, trafficked into this group, born into this group, that are continually to be victimized by the lack of repatriation. And so we need to focus on what victims need. And that is very, very different. I think often when we think about victims, we think of this homogeneous group, but it's not. And we need to look at these different minority groups or these different victimized groups and think about what each community needs and try to serve those interests.
Great. Thank you so much, Devorah. We have about 5 or 6 minutes left. I'll ask another question for Pari. What are the recovery needs related specifically to the Yazidi community, and how far have we gotten, and how far do we need to continue to go to help them out?
Thank you. We are dealing with a heavily traumatized community, living in tents for 10 years. There's not a lot of jobs available. A lot of the people are poor. They do not have the income, the money to sustain themselves. But on the other side, you have a country that operates on a yearly budget of $153 billion. I mean, you just can't believe that people are poor and have nothing to eat, and on the other hand, you live in a country that has $153 billion budget. Iraq needs to take some responsibility to take care of its citizens. And at the moment, it's not doing that. It only does that for those who have political representation and who can fight for a piece of that budget. And Yazidis do not have that. If you want to see any changes in the next few years, I think that the international community should really pressure Iraq to use some of that money, some of that budget to care for its own citizens. I know, like, we as Yazidi organizations, we really look at the international community to support us, to help give trauma treatment to the Yazidi community, to help go after justice and accountability, to ensure that people can find jobs, we train them to get different skills. It is very small, the part that we're trying to do, but it does change lives. And I think that's what we're trying to focus on. Like, every step we take forward, it is a step forward and not one back.
Of course. Devorah, Iraq has repatriated more IS-affiliated individuals than any other country. What are some of the problems Iraq is facing in this endeavor?
Yeah, I think that very much complements the kind of the need for the victim communities, but also IS-affiliated families. And we use the IS-affiliated because it's a mix of individuals, right? When we talk about specifically individuals who are IS-affiliated, these are specifically Iraqis. These are not people who, some of them may have gone up and joined the group with absolute agency, and some of them may have been caught up and swept up and lived under the Islamic State territory. And so there is a need to look on these on a case-by-case basis, which is very hard when you're dealing with a population of 30,000 as you're trying to sort through. And as I mentioned, so far, Iraq has repatriated 1,200 Syrians from detention facilities. These individuals have gone directly from detention facilities to Iraqi prisons and been put on trial, and 9,500 individuals from detention camps, specifically Al-Hol, to Jeddah 1 transit camp. And so they're kind of operating two different tracks. The conviction rate in Iraq for individual cases on IS affiliation is around 98%. So, and there's a widespread use of the death sentence. And so there's a big fear that the individuals who are being repatriated specifically from detention facilities to Iraqi prisons, and this has been raised by Amnesty International, is that there's a real concern that they're facing an all but guaranteed conviction rate upon their return. And so there's questions about Iraq's trials and systems and evidentiary use. And as I mentioned, the terrorism law is pretty all-encompassing. So there isn't, you could be a cook for the group and you could be a mastermind for the group, and they're not differentiating, and they're not using core international crimes or any gender-based crimes to prosecute these individuals. But what's really interesting is for individuals who are going into the transit camp, so this is my majority individuals from Al-Hol, which are majority women and children, there's challenges as well. It is a transit camp. The idea is individuals come in, they are evaluated, and they move back out into society. As mentioned by Pari, there's a lack of accountability in this process that needs to be addressed. And in order to leave the camp, there's also challenges. So they must obtain a security clearance, meaning they are checked. There's been questions about how the security clearance is done. Sometimes they just call the local village and say, do you know this person? The person says, no, okay, that person's clean. While not necessarily gathering witness or victim testimonies. They need to have local authorities in the area permission to resettle. And in some cases, they need to have a sponsor. But a UN study basically said that women-headed households have a harder time finding sponsors than men. And the majority of individuals looking for sponsors are women. And so we have a real issue with these gendered obstacles that further constrain release back into society.
Great. Thank you so much, Devorah. We're coming up on the hour mark for this event. I know everybody's time is precious, but I wanted to thank all the panelists for this excellent event, and also to remind those watching that if you're more curious about this, please read the most recent publications from Pari, from Dr. Margolin and Dr. Vale about these issues and why it continues to be an important issue set, and it's very much unresolved still. So I think it's important to remember that we need to continue to discuss these issues until they are resolved. So I wanted to thank everybody tuning in today, and those who maybe are watching this as an archive version YouTube in the future. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.